All right, thank you for the introduction. Hi, everyone. My name is Addie. And today I'd like to start by giving a huge thank you to my mentors and also to the PIRE staff, and also to Brittany Williams, who's a PhD candidate. And this project is kind of an offshoot built off of her previous work. So I worked with Dr. Suzanne Brouwer from Radboud University in the Netherlands, and we met about biweekly. She's been a really great support for data analysis and just cultural fun, even in the online environment. And also Dr. Naveen Vishwanathan and Brittany Williams again. Thank you so much, everyone. So my project is titled Investigating Linguistic Release from Masking Through Remote Experimentation. So let's delve first into what linguistic release from masking is. There we go. So I'm sure we've all been in a situation where you're listening to speech and you're trying to focus, and then someone comes up behind you and says something really interesting, and you're very distracted now by what's going on in the background. You can't quite focus on what's in front of you. But now think of a situation where, say, you're a monolingual English speaker, like most of us, but not all of us are, and you're listening to someone speak to you in English, and someone comes up behind you and starts talking in, say, Mandarin Chinese or a language that you have no idea, you're not familiar with it at all. You can effectively ignore what's going on in the background now because you do recognize there is speech, but you can't understand it, so it's not going to draw your attention. That's what we call linguistic release from masking. Because you don't understand that linguistic information behind you, you can release yourself from that distraction and focus solely on the target speech in front of you. So that's kind of what we're manipulating here. This is an adapted graph from a study from Cal Andrusio and her colleagues in 2014, looking at measuring this linguistic release effect. And what she did was she had English monolinguals listen to English target speech in the presence of English background noise, and then the same, not the same English targets, but also English targets in Chinese background speech. And she found that people were able to report what the English target was saying much better when it was Chinese in the background. As you can see from that bar graph, there is a very big difference in performance based on how much people were getting distracted by that background speech. So what this project is doing is, like I said, building on previous research and trying to take this one step further and saying, can we use this ability, this linguistic release of ignoring the background speech to determine someone's language proficiency? So what we had to do because of the pandemic, we kind of had to recreate previous studies. We have all this data and all this great research that proves that LRM is a real effect in person. So we had to take all of this and rebuild it to be online. So what we did was we took 30 monolingual English speakers recruited from Prolific, which was our third-party source, and we had them listen to 20 English sentences in the presence of each of three maskers, English, Dutch, and Mandarin, and they had to type the target sentence, and we used LabVANCed to build our experiment. And what we found was the same effect as before, that participants are doing best in Mandarin in the background and worst in English in the background. And let me quickly explain why this graph is upside down. So the reason this graph is upside down is we actually estimated these scores using a threshold estimate. So if you look at the very top of that graph, it starts at a 0 condition. That's when the target speech and the background speech are at the same volume. And what we did was we adaptively turned the volume up on the background speech while holding the target speech constant. And we wanted to see how much louder that background speech could be than the target before people's performance on the task dropped below 50%. So if you're looking, the most negative score is the best score, because that means that even though the background speech is significantly louder than the target, people are still able to report what the target is saying with over 50% accuracy. So as you can see, Dutch was kind of our middle condition. Mandarin was much better than English in the background. So now we're on to phase 2. Now that we've proven that LRM still works even when it's online and we can't control someone's environment, now we're going to go into that big question of, can we measure language proficiency? So we looked at 57 Dutch-English bilinguals performing a language proficiency battery first. And then our next steps to this experiment that we haven't quite gotten to yet are going to be to select participants from that pool and invite them back to do the LRM task that the monolinguals did. So let me explain the language proficiency battery. The language proficiency battery is built from previous work that is the traditional way that we assess how proficient someone is in a language. So we ran our Dutch English bilinguals through an English language proficiency battery to see how close to monolingual performance they were. The first task is the Boston naming task, where you see pictures like these and you have to say out loud what that picture is. So I picked an easy one and a more difficult one. Most participants are able to understand that the first picture is a wheel and they can say that. Some monolingual English speakers even forget that that second picture is called a trellis. So that's, we have like high frequency words and low frequency words. Then we have the next two tasks are the verbal fluency tasks. We have letters and categories. So they'll first see a letter on the screen and they have a couple seconds to name as many words as they can that start with the phoneme. So it says letter, but really when it says P, we're not looking for words like phone and photograph. We're looking for paper, pencil, words like that. So they have a couple trials of those. And then they get categories where they have a certain amount of time to name as many words as they can think of that fit into the category tools. And most people report mostly nouns, but I suppose you could report verbs as well that have to do with tools, but we're really looking for nouns here. The next one is the non-word repetition task. I like this task because it's kind of a working memory word learning task. So they hear streams of non-words like these that are on the screen that follow English grammar, and they could be words, but they're not. And they have as much time as they need once they hear the stimulus to repeat as many of the words back as they can remember, and the speech streams slowly get longer and longer. The last task, and the one that I'm going to talk about most, is the lexical decision task. And this one is where they see a word on the screen that looks like it could be a word in English, and they have to decide if it's actually a word or not. It's interesting because they don't have to know what the word means, they don't have to identify it in any way, except that, yes, I think that's a word, or no, I don't think that's a word. So mensible looks like it could be a word, it looks like sensible, but carbohydrate is kind of a strange word, but we know that it is actually a word in English. So again, we have high frequency words and low frequency words. So here's kind of where we're going with this whole battery thing. We're expecting to see a relationship between traditional language proficiency measures and this LRM quick test that Brittany Williams and other colleagues have been researching. So we want to see a relationship where participants who score very high on that language proficiency battery, showing us that they are very proficient in English, are scoring very low on that English linguistic release from masking condition. And because they're bilinguals, if they're very proficient in English, we expect their English and Dutch scores on that task to look relatively the same and both be much lower than their Mandarin score. This reverse is also true. If they're scoring low on that language proficiency battery, that means they're not quite proficient in English. We expect their English scores to be better than the Dutch scores. Maybe not quite as good as the Mandarin scores because they are still somewhat familiar with English, reflecting that English isn't as distracting to them because they're not as proficient in it. So here's what I mean by looking at this language proficiency battery. This is the data from the lexical decision task, and it ranges from 0 trials correct on the left to 60 trials correct all the way to the right. It's kind of an expanded number line, so you can see all the little dots. And what I've done is I've broken this into quartiles so we can look at how proficient our participants are. So the black box all the way to the left shows my low proficiency participants, and those are people that scored between 0 and 45 out of 60 trials correct, and I have 14 participants. As you can see, we do have some outliers. I think the reasonable assumption is that those people accidentally clicked the wrong button for word versus non-word. They just flipped them. But towards the right of the black box, you can see that there are some just low proficiency bilinguals, which is exactly what we wanted to get. Then the yellow box, that second one, we have our medium low proficiency, which is a score of 45 to 51, and that's also 14 participants. The pink box, that third box, is medium high proficiency from 51 to 56, which is 13 participants. And then all the way to the right in the green box, we have high proficiency bilinguals, which is scores of 56 to 60, and we had 16 participants. So the goal is going to be to take a couple people from each of those categories, run them through the linguistic release from masking quick test, and see how those scores match up. We want to see opposite effects of the scores. So I've actually gotten so much out of this project. Again, thank you so much to everyone. The online experiment tool that we used was LabVance, and I actually was able to get enough practice and enough proficiency on that platform that I recently applied for a job with that company, like a part-time online kind of customer support representative position. I'm in the negotiating stage with them right now, which is really exciting. But I would not have known that that was something that I was capable of doing without this PIRE project. So that's going to be very helpful in graduate school as well. That's having that experience, being able to do online research and not be afraid of being very independent and just kind of running things on my own. So that's been helpful. I also got a lot of skill interacting anonymously with participants through Prolific. It's very gratifying when you get an anonymous message that says, "Hey, I really liked your study. That was fun." It's kind of exciting. It's also very, very helpful to get an anonymous feedback that says, "Yeah, that was really difficult. I think you should change something." Like, thank you so much. From the researcher perspective, sometimes we don't realize just how people are going about these studies. So I got a lot of experience with that. I also had great fun collaborating with other labs and researchers, not only with Dr. Brouwer in the Netherlands, but we also met with a lab from Australia who is doing similar linguistic release for masking research with accents, I believe. And that was really exciting. That's coordinating time zones and things, as other people have mentioned. It's a very interesting experience. And I also got data scoring and analysis experience, which is something that I was really looking forward to because I would say that that was my weak point when I started research, was just not knowing how to analyze data, ANOVA tests, t-tests. It was really great to get hands-on experience looking at that. So I want to say thank you to everyone. And if anyone has anything that I can clarify for them, I'm more than happy to do so. Thank you.
Thank you. And we have time for questions.
It was really interesting, and I might miss the part that you have explained it about the linguistic release part.
Mhm.
And based on the background language, people would comprehend, like, can erase those conversations and
Right.
focus on the real. And
Mhm.
you said the Mandarin was the lowest score. Am I
Yes.
correct?
So
And then
that's okay.
yeah.
That was that reverse graph. So
Mhm.
for the way that we were estimating the scores for that graph, a lower score was better performance because the lower the
Okay.
score meant that we had turned up the volume on
Mhm.
or the perceived volume, I should say. We had turned up the perceived volume on the background speech, so it was perceived as louder than the target, which is more negative based on the estimate we were using. So
Mhm.
that meant the participants were doing better because they were getting more trials correct as the
Mm.
perceived volume got louder and louder. It's a little bit of a funky way to estimate data. We only estimated data with thresholds for that part of the experiment, but that's where that was coming from. Yeah. Did that help?
Yes, and additionally for the monolingual speaker listeners, and why is it Dutch much familiar than Mandarin? Is that
Right.
why
So it's very
okay.
interesting because the monolingual speakers were not familiar with Dutch or Mandarin, but because Dutch shares more linguistic similarity with English than Mandarin does, there was that medium performance. Yeah. That's, if you listen to the Dutch targets, you'll hear something that sounds kind of like English, but then it's not. So that's kind of where that medium performance was, whereas they were completely unfamiliar with Mandarin on all accounts. Yeah.
Thank you.
Mhm.
So your lexical decision task, these were written forms or they were auditory?
Good question. Yes, they were written forms. They saw the word flash on the screen. So the majority of the language proficiency battery is recording the participant's voice. But the only stimuli that are auditory is that non-word repetition task, because we're really looking for like working memory demands in that made up language.
Do you think there's any effect of a weird orthography system like English as opposed to one that's more transparent, say Italian or German?
I hadn't actually thought about that, but that is a very good question. There definitely could be some effects there. Mhm.
The other question I have with the picture naming is, those line drawings in many cases, I mean, probably for people in Boston, they work, but if you try them elsewhere, I mean, yes, the wheel looks like it, but I mean, if you've spent your whole life in an apartment, born and raised, you know what a trellis is.
Mhm.
And some of those line drawings that I've seen over the years are, native
Yes.
speakers, native citizens sometimes have trouble with them as opposed to actual, ecologically valid photographs. Any thoughts on that?
Yes. That is very, very true. I ran, my brother and his friends were like my test subjects for this. And there were a couple words that they had to sit and think about. I know that one of the stimuli is a latch, like it's a picture of like a garden gate latch, and that can definitely cause people to pause. So that is something to take in consideration. We're not looking for 100% accuracy. What we're looking for is near monolingual accuracy, I think would be the best way to think about it. We're looking for
Yeah.
comparable performance. Yeah.
But it's widely used and it's normed, but I mean, it has all the
Mhm.
problems of like SATs and GREs and,
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. And there
All
are a
right,
lot of,
thanks.
yes, thank you. There are a lot of like speech tests that we use, just learning from my classes in CSD. There are a lot of speech tests that have normed samples, but they're not quite there with everyone being able to recognize it easily. Yeah.
More questions?
I don't have a question, but if you have any complaints about LabVAS, you know who to go to. That's all I have.